So we are going to finish up, I promise, the Pelagian Controversy today. I've taken a little more time on it than I probably should have, but it's because we didn't spend any time on it much last year, and I wanted to make sure I got this into your notes because you will find it useful years from now, years to come. You'll look back with fond memories on this discussion. You'll think, oh, that was so helpful. Even though you don't quite appreciate it now, it will be very useful then. Right, Mr. Dupree? Right, thank you. So we covered the 4 points yesterday of semi-Pelagianism. It's the compromise view. The question was asked, is there any particular name associated with it? There's quite a few names associated. You need to know none of them, so I'm not going to bother you with them. No great thinkers are here. These were more or less political compromisers, trying to figure out some way to accommodate the problems that had been provoked by the controversy between Augustine and Pelagius. And I'd like to just trace this forward a little bit. The Pelagian controversy itself, we could just in very round numbers put about the year 400. Augustine died in 430. The controversy itself, of course, lasted for some years. This is not a public debate, but the writings of each of them, more or less challenging the other. The people of the world, the Christian people, were reading this stuff, being influenced by it. And generally speaking, Augustine was coming out on top, because he was far more biblical, far more faithful to Christian understanding generally. But the problem is, even though people liked Augustine a whole lot more than they liked Pelagius, the church at this time was not prepared, not able, I would say, to embrace this robust predestinarian theology. It just didn't buy it, And so the church was trying to find some way to accommodate the great insights of Augustine and avoid the errors of Pelagius, and it was out of that. And I'm going to say over about the next 100 years or so, that you begin to get this semi-Pelagian view. But semi-Pelagian itself was eventually condemned as a heresy. So it didn't quite make it up the flagpole either. And the question just lay dormant. So through the Middle Ages, you do not have a whole lot of discussion of that whole problem, of the extent of the effect of original sin on us, how capable we are of responding to grace, how much are we dependent on grace. It's certainly an issue that's out there, but nobody looks at it with the level of intensity that had been going on during this controversy. Then you get to the Reformation. What century would we say is generally the century of the Reformation? It would be a phenomenon of the blank century, and it would be what? Put a number on it. It's a 16th century, thank you. Remember, 16th century is the 1500s, right? There you are. Why are you giggling over there? What did Avery say something funny?
A good guess.
Okay. What was your guess, Mr. Geely?
Plead the fifth.
Pleads the fifth. All right. Okay. So get this in your heads. The events of the Reformation are the 16th century. Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. In what year? What year is that? Spencer?
1517.
Very good. 1517, October 31st. Reformation Day. The Diet of Worms, 1521. The Augsburg Gathering, 1530. Calvin is converted, 1533. Blah, blah, blah. All of this stuff happens. We'll look at this later, but just understand that it's all 16th century. Where would the Reformers, virtually all of them, where would they be on our chart? Where would we put them with respect to the chart I've put up here? They would all wind up where, Sidney?
With Augustine.
That's right. So, what you've got is the church kind of floating without a real clear definition on this point. Aquinas speaks to it, but not somewhat ambiguously. But it's okay. It's all right. sneak right in. Joe is once again in trouble. Trying to ignore. All right. So, come over here. We're going to have Luther, Calvin, all of the others. Zwingli would be here. John Knox, Scottish Reformation, the Puritans that kind of come out of it. All of these people, and in fact the pre-Reformation, John Huss would have been here, and others. So you have, without exception really, all of the reformers reinstating in their theology this Augustinian view. That's why we often call it Calvinism. It should be called Augustinianism, but it's like Calvin gets the credit. He didn't add anything to Augustine. He quoted Augustine more than any other ancient source. I mentioned that to you the other day. He relied heavily upon him. Calvin was an innovator, but not here. This is not where he added new data, new theology. Luther was an Augustinian monk, before the Reformation. He was deeply involved in reading and studying Augustine. So the point is, the Reformation just brings us back really to this Augustinian view. Then, in the 17th century, you have a new character who comes along who is reared in this Reformation tradition. He's reared in a strongly Calvinistic background, and he revolts against it. He's kind of a Renaissance scholar. He's a very bright guy. And he thinks this predestinarian stuff goes too far. So he reacts to not only Calvin, but Augustine. And he gives us a new view, which I would say lands right about here, somewhere between Semi-Pelagianism and Augustinianism. And this guy's name is, but you know who I'm after? 17th century character. This is the 1600s. It's about 100 years after the Reformation. And his name is, he's Dutch, grows up in Holland, in a Dutch Reformed tradition, very strong. And he is, anybody know?
What's the first letter of his name?
Want to play hangman? Okay. Josiah.
Is it Arminian?
Yes, Arminius.
Oh my God, get out of here.
All right. So his name is Jacob Arminius. Jacob Arminius. And out of Arminius comes the theology that at least some of you are familiar with or know the term Arminianism. Okay, it goes back to Arminius. And he is trying to be more biblically, consistent than the Semi-Pelagians were, but he is quite specifically reacting to, again, this rather strongly predestinarian theology that you find in Augustine. Do you understand? And I hope you all kind of grab this. This is, you might say, this is a spectrum of grace, And down here with Pelagius, theoretically, you can be saved with 0% of grace. You can, just by the exercise of your own strong, conscientious efforts, be saved. I've put semi-Pelagians in the middle, but I'd say actually the split here would be something like, let's say 60-40, meaning it's about 60% grace, 40% human effort. You can make a start to salvation without grace, but you need grace to finish the job, that kind of deal. Arminianism tries to become much more true to the Scriptures, and I put the percentage here in Arminianism at about 95% grace, all right, maybe even more. He's trying to, well, even more than that. That's not even fair. I'm going to put it about 99% grace, all right? But there is still a little bit of human involvement. And so what I'd like to look at now briefly is Arminianism. And I'm going to give this to you in 6 points. 6-point Arminianism. But before I give you the points, just a little bit of trivia, which you may already know this, but if not, you should learn it now. How many of you ever heard of the 5 points of Calvin? Good, that's great. Because I think I taught that to you last year, right? Okay. Calvin, of course, himself had never heard of the 5 points of Calvin. You understand that? Calvin never heard, invented, wrote, developed, or mentioned the so-called 5 points of Calvin. Where did the 5 points of Calvin actually come from? Where did they originate? Anybody know? Historically, what happened? Anybody know? Do you know, Sydney? No? Do you know, Avery? No?
Did people that believed in Calvinism kind of take his works and make the 5 points out of it?
Yeah, but that leaves out a critical part of it, but you're right. Laura?
They wrote them in a defense to an attack.
That's right. And do you know who put up the attack?
I guess the Arminians.
Okay. And this was a movement in Holland. You should know this. This is good stuff, church history. This was a movement in Holland led by Arminius called the Remonstrants. The Remonstrants, R-E-M-O-N-S-T-R-A-N-T-S. And they used that term because they were remonstrating, namely objecting to Calvin and Calvinism and the Dutch Reformed heritage there in Holland. And it was the Remonstrants that wrote 5 objections. Okay? 5 objections. They published it. And those 5 objections of the Remonstrants became the 5 points of Calvin, ironically. Okay? They were just the corollary of each one, the Calvinistic side of each one of those. So the 5 points of Calvin were actually written originally as objections by the Remonstrants. Then there was a council that was convened in Holland to respond to the Remonstrants, and it was called the Council of, Reformed churches in Holland, Council of, anybody know this? Council of Dort. Ever heard of Council of Dort? Anybody ever heard of it? Have you? Okay. It was out of the Council of Dort that you get the 5 points, which were actually a systematic point-for-point response to the Remonstrants, and that has become the 5 points of Calvin. And in English, they are organized around a nifty little acrostic that is the word good. All right, that's just a little bit of trivia on this. But anyway, let's look at the, this is 6-point Arminianism, not 5-point, 6-point. All right, number 1, Arminius taught, number 1, that we have inherited what he called a diseased nature. A diseased nature from Adam. This already represents a shift. Now this is a subtle point, but if you really want to understand this, you need to get this point. Up until this time, original sin, which is this sinful condition into which we are born, original sin is not the sin committed by Adam and Eve, it is the condition of sinfulness at the origins of our person, the heart of our person. Up until this time, that had been viewed as a kind of judgment. God had pronounced judgment upon us, and the judgment was in part that we became slaves to sin. It was judicial. Arminius shifts the ground slightly, and instead of conceiving of it as a punishment, that we are sinful as a punishment or a judgment against us, it simply represents an infection, a disease state in which we are born. It's like you have a virus. You know, you've heard of crack babies, right? We're all born kind of like crack babies. Our mother got it from her mother, and down, all the way back to Adam and Eve, who had contracted this disease in the garden. This disease state, and it's been passed down largely through the soul, through the reproductive events involving not just reproduction of the body, but reproduction of the soul. So it involves a theological notion called traducianism. Is that a new term? Anybody heard of traducianism? It's a term you'll bump into. If you do any theological reading, you'll come across it. And it is the idea that when you are born, you have inherited both the, let's say, DNA of your parents, but also the soul, some little contribution of the soul of your parents, and it comes to you diseased. It's a diseased soul. Okay. So your sinfulness, what is sometimes called the sinful nature, which I might add is more of an Arminian term than a Reformed term. That phrase, sinful nature, which is not found in the Bible, but tended to start being used to describe this kind of diseased state of the soul. That's point one. So far so good? Does that kind of make sense? You understand the difference between a judicial sinfulness and a kind of diseased sinfulness. Does that make sense? All okay with that? Okay.
I'm a little confused. Is this saying that, from what I've gathered, it just sounds like the same thing as the sin nature, how we kind of are born with it. So
okay.
What's
the effect is somewhat the same. The cause is what's different.
Okay.
In the Reformed tradition, the cause of that sinful state is that God pronounced judgment. Part of the sentence of judgment against Adam and Eve was, oh, you like sin? Okay, I'm going to make you a slave to sin. It's like saying to someone, oh, you like to drink? Okay, fine, I'm going to make you an alcoholic. So what started as a lark becomes this horrific addiction. And we think of that with respect to various kinds of addiction. Somebody decides to experiment with meth. It sounds like fun. 6 months later, they've just destroyed their lives because they're addicted to that stuff. Well, that in the Reformed tradition was kind of like God's judgment. Okay, you like sin, I'm going to make you a slave to sin. You're going to be addicted to it. In the Arminian tradition, sinfulness does not come in as a punishment. It's not something God does as a kind of judicial act. It is just a natural consequence of sinning that leads to a kind of diseased condition. You touch something that's infected and you contract the disease, And that has some important consequences in the broader theology, but if that makes sense, right?
Okay.
All right, number two, second point. Arminius says, we have a certain latent ability to do good. We have a certain latent ability to do good. In other words, in spite of this sinful condition, this sinful disease, there's a little particle in you. Remember my circle here? Pelagius said your sinfulness is right at the edge, right? Remember that? It's very peripheral. You have a heart of gold, right? That? Okay? Augustine said you have no heart of gold. It's all tainted, right? The Semi-Pelagian said, well, you've got a heart of gold, but it's a lot smaller. It's down there. You can start for salvation, but you can never finish the job, right? Arminius said, you've got a tiny, 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 tiny little particle, ever so small, inside you. That's a heart, by the way. I know you can't see it, but that's a heart. And it's still in there. A little tiny ability to do good. Now, please understand, Arminius would say, there's not enough strength in it for it to ever actually do good. He wants to make it clear, a person, unregenerate person without grace will never do good. He's trying to be faithful to the biblical text. He's working hard to escape the evident problems of semi-Pelagianism. He wants to be much closer. That's why I put it at 99% here, you know. But it is something in us that at least has the potential. A little tiny bit of good floating in there in a kind of island, floating in a sea of wickedness. You see? You with me there? Okay. Yes?
If it doesn't have any power to do any good,
Mhm.
it's so small, then what's the point of it? Why
Well,
would you say...
I'm glad you asked the question, I see. Because that leads us straight to point, well, actually 4. Okay, but it's a great question, and I hope I'll answer it before we're done. Here's point 3. We need grace to be saved, Arminian said. But that grace is given to everybody. We need grace to be saved, but that grace is given to everybody. Alicia?
Does that mean that the grace is given to everyone before their heart is changed?
Yes.
So no matter what, they're going to
Yes.
heaven?
Pardon me?
So no matter what, they're going to heaven?
No, this is not universalism. Good question, good thought. Let me just clarify it. The grace is given to everyone. We need grace to be saved. The grace is given to everybody. The term that he applied to it is called Prevenient Grace. Has anybody in this room ever heard the expression Prevenient Grace? Have you? Okay. What's your understanding of it, Sarah? Do you have any idea?
Just what you said.
Okay, all right. Literally, prevenient grace means pre-venue, coming before. Okay? Or, in Italian, venire, to come. So, this is grace that comes before, Alicia, salvation. Here's this person. I shouldn't have erased it. You got the term now, prevenient grace. We'll reconstruct our guy with the microscopic heart of gold there. All right. Prevenient grace comes to this person before that person is saved. They don't have, they are so weak. In other words, it kind of reminds me of a dog I used to have named JB. Don't ask me what JB stood for. We never knew. We just called it JB. JB was it was a hybrid, I think peekapoo or something like that was what they called it. Anyway, that dog was amazing in its prime at catching frisbees. This is back in the 70s. It was a great dog, and I would throw the frisbee out there as hard as I could in an open field, you know. And that dog was like a bullet. It was only about that big. I mean, it wasn't that big a dog. It would just shoot down the field like a rocket. And the timing was perfect, and I would say at least 8 times out of 10 it would succeed. No matter how I threw the frisbee, where I threw it, how hard I threw it, just shoot down there and leap up in the air. It was a work of art. Snag that baby right out of the air and come back for another one. You know, you've all kind of played that game with the dog. And JB was a genius at snagging the frisbee. Well, JB eventually got old. This is sad. I hope I don't become emotional because, you know, you get attached to these animals. But anyway, JB eventually got old. And there came a point where you had to throw the frisbee very, very gently. Just a little kind of thing. And he might be able to catch it. I just didn't have the moves he used to have. And it was so funny. I'd say within the last week of JB's life, we'd stand out in the backyard and there'd be JB just kind of, you know, really, really just clinging to life. And we'd toss the frisbee and his ear would twitch. It was awful. It still brings tears to my eyes. It really does. It was just... And you knew in his heart he wanted to go after that frisbee, right? You could just see his eyes kind of following his ear twitching, land on the ground, no JB there. And that's kind of where Arminius leaves us. Our ears twitch a little bit, you know, but we just have no ability. We cannot act on that impulse. It's a little tiny bit of good in us, but we just are so enslaved, so broken, so debilitated, so diseased, so infected. We just can't move. We just look. We need help. And the help that comes is called Prevenient Grace. I'll just abbreviate that. Prevenient Grace. And it comes to everybody. Okay? It comes to everybody. Number 4, those who cooperate with Prevenient Grace are saved. Those who cooperate are saved. Those who decline to cooperate are lost. You see, and so Arminius is really trying to give a very fair hearing to the biblical texts that teach so clearly how affected by sin we are. But Arminius still cannot quite abide the idea that God simply chooses. I was saying it's 0%, I put this 40-60. Augustine, of course, would say it's 100% grace, meaning we contribute nothing, God just chooses, changes, saves, predestines, end of conversation. We're not utterly passive, we respond to that grace for sure, you know, and so on, but the original event is monergistic. God acts, and that's it. And Arminius is very impressed with how deeply affected by sin we are, and he sees the implications of that. He sees how desperately in need of grace we are, but he just can't quite get his brain around the idea that God simply chooses some and not others. That, for him, is too bitter a pill. And so he still wants to leave in that little heart a little choice. And ultimately, the choice of salvation is still yours. It's not God's. God gives you the grace, and then you decide whether to cooperate. And that's what gives meaning to all those biblical texts that say, whosoever will may come. No one can come to me except the Father draw him. Arminius sees that. God's grace has to be there. Has to reach that person, but you can still walk away. You know, you still have the responsibility. He's finally not going to just reach in and twist your will into doing something contrary, you know, to what you would otherwise do. Arminius cannot explain, nor does he try. He leaves it at the level of mystery why it is that some people choose positively and some don't. I don't think he can follow it because it takes him to places he doesn't want to go theologically. The big problem with Calvinists is they have to deal with this very harsh idea that God chooses some and not others, and the ones God chooses are saved, and the one God doesn't choose are lost. And that's a bitter pill, and Calvinists have to deal with that, and they do every day of the week. Arminians have to deal with the problem of how come some people cooperate and some people don't. Two people go to the same evangelistic service, hear the same sermon, they got the same IQ, same education, same background, same everything. One of them, at the end of the service, goes forward. The other one goes home. Why? Why did one person choose for and the other person against? That's the problem the Arminian has to wrestle with. Both theologies have problems. I'm trying to be equal opportunity problems here, you know, for theology. So I know every one of you in this room is somewhere on this question. I'm simply saying the problem for the Arminian is answering that question of choice. If you say, well, it's because this person had more grace, then you're a Calvinist, right? If you say, well, it's because this person was better than the other, well, then how did that happen? How did one guy turn out to be better than the other, and that's why they made the choice? Who made you better than the other? You see, that's the ticklish problem the Arminian has. Y'all follow that? See that? I'm just trying to get you seeing where the nub of the issue is. I think both sides have, tremendous theological debates, thinking to work through here. All right, so Arminius says those who cooperate are saved. Number 5, fifth point of Arminianism, justifying grace is resistible. Smart money says it's going to snow for the next 24 hours, but we will not have a snow day tomorrow. That's what the smart money say. I know what you guys are thinking. You're praying for snow and 10 feet of it, because you're hoping, I can read minds, you're hoping that there will be enough snow to cancel school tomorrow, but not so much snow that you can't make it up on the slopes tomorrow, Is there enough snow to ski yet?
Yes.
I was thinking there was, yeah. So I know what's right in your minds. Well, if anybody wants to place any wagers, I will be glad to be the stakeholder, I'll hold your money for you safely. Number 6. Y'all got number 5? Justifying grace is resistible. Remember Calvinism, one of the points of Calvinism is irresistible grace, right? Well, Arminianism, grace is resistible. Krista, go ahead.
In the other points you were saying that we need grace to be saved, and then is the justifying grace the same thing? Is this all the same kind of grace?
Justifying grace is the grace that saves. So prevenient grace comes. If you cooperate with it, then it becomes justifying grace and you're saved. Does that answer your question, or did I miss it?
Yeah, but then that justifying grace is, some people still turn away from that?
Okay, what he means by that, good question, that's a subtle question, but what he's saying is that prevenient grace will become justifying grace unless you resist it, and hence the justifying effect of that grace is resistible. Does that make sense? What does Arminius do with the terms in the Bible, like the term elect? Frequently used to describe the people of God. They are the elect, and so on. He says that elect, the word itself, refers to a class of people, not individual people. In a sense, we have a club here. I'm not trying to be dismissive or pejorative. I'm just saying it's like a group, a club, and you can choose whether to be elect. You opt in, you opt out of a class. And the class is called, among other things, the elect. And he would give as Exhibit A of that Judas. Judas was chosen, wasn't he, by Jesus? And Jesus himself says, "Have I not chosen you, yet one of you is a traitor." They opted in. Judas opted in. He was a disciple. No one forced him to be a disciple. He was a disciple, and he opted out. You can opt in, opt out of that class. So that's 6 points of Arminianism. Questions about that? Does that make sense? You follow that? Kind of see what he's wrestling with.
Wait, so that was the last point.
That's the last point. Did I give you 6 points?
Comments in my notes.
Well, that's...
Let me run through them. Here we are. Point 1, we have a diseased nature. Point 2, we nevertheless have a certain ability to do good. Tiny little heart inside, right? Point 3, we need grace, but grace is given to all. Prevenient grace. Number 4, those who cooperate with that prevenient grace are saved. Number 5, that grace is resistible. Number 6, the elect refers to a class.
So last point in opposition to the perseverance of the saints?
Yes, yeah, it is. I didn't mention this, but you can include it in your notes. Arminius does allow for the fact that you can, as a Christian, commit treason against your faith and against your Lord and lose your salvation. Of course, Calvinism would say that God chose you, and those whom he chooses, he hangs on to, that it's all grace, so nobody loses their salvation because people chosen by God will persevere in their faith. Any other questions? All right. Yes. No. Yes.
How does that point address the verse that says, once your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, it cannot be removed?
Yeah, Arminius says, well, the Bible also talks about blotting names out. And that idea that a name could be blotted out implies that it was there and then disappeared, right? So you've got, even that one doesn't quite, Okay, I hope that I've been fair to both sides here. I know that in this room we got both teams represented, and I've tried to be even-handed. We're not quite done with it, but, hopefully you get the issues here. Yeah.
So how would an Arminian say you keep your salvation?
Arminian would say you keep your salvation by continuing in the faith, and that in a sense you need to keep dedicating yourself. You need to keep coming to the church and coming to the means of grace, but you can any day of the week decide to walk away, and some people do, and they lose their salvation. So it always is a little bit of your cooperation. You keep cooperating. Most Arminians would strongly argue that you don't just accidentally fall off the wagon. That it takes a pretty robust, definitive act of rejecting Christ for you to lose your salvation. That God does a whole lot to try to keep you in. He'll convict you of sin. He'll put pressure on you. He'll do all kinds of things to make sure you do. But ultimately, if you say, I've had enough of this Christian stuff, I'm out of here, he's not going to force you to stay. That would be, I think that's the way you'd hear that. I might say that, there are various strands of Arminianism. Not all Arminians would say it quite the way I've talked to folks in this tradition. Catholicism would be very much here, very similar. They don't call themselves Arminian, but Catholicism has essentially taken this particular view. And like I was saying, many Catholics live in a constant anxiety. And personally, I've met people who would not be Catholics, be Protestants, who have a constant anxiety about whether they've lost their salvation. So I don't think it's, you get kind of a spread of views there. For the most part, I think Arminians tend to be confident of their salvation, have assurance of it, but always allow for the fact that a person can walk away with very tragic consequences. All right, the only thing I want to add to this is a later development called Wesleyanism. Wesley comes, and if anything, if Arminius was 99, then Wesley was 99.9. He tries to cut it just that much more thin. Fundamentally, Wesley is the same as Arminius with a couple of tiny little adjustments. He, of course, came out of the Anglican Church. This is later, maybe 18th century. He would say basically this: we are radically corrupted, totally corrupted by the fall. There's not even a little heart in there. There's nothing. So Wesley really sounds originally like a Augustinian. However, Wesley then adds, and this is a novelty in his theology. I'm not saying it's wrong, therefore, I'm just saying nobody had really quite said it this way till Wesley. He said, one of the universal effects of the crucifixion of Christ was a restoration of grace to all people, such that all could be saved by cooperating with it. So you see, he winds up with Arminius, but he starts with Augustine, and the trigger, the defining difference is that he wants to incorporate a universal effect of the cross into his theology. He ties that to the verse in the Gospel of John that Jesus lights every man that comes into the world. He sees that as a redemptive effect, not like Augustine, who saw it as an epistemological idea. Wesley sees it more as a soteriological idea. Last year, I think I gave you my favorite little image of this, didn't I? The boat. But it's so much fun. Let's do it again. Just for So, you know, here you are. Here's the seashore, a little steep. Here's the seashore, more gradual. You're a Pelagian, of course. You're standing on the shore, and you got 1 foot. You're kind of a strange character because you got one long leg there. 1 foot in the water, you know. So you're on the Oregon coast. You're standing on the shore, right by what is it called, Haystack Rock or something there. You know where I'm talking about. Beautiful place. And you could drown. You're standing on the shore. You could theoretically drown, but you have to work at it. Because right now, the only thing in peril is your big toe, because that's in the water. The rest of you is safe. And that's Pelagianism. You are safe, pretty much, and you can resist sin easily, and you can, you know, avoid the perils of the deep by just simply exercising a certain amount of rational self-control. Okay, if you're a semi-Pelagian, you're much worse off. So here, you may recall, it's a good ship Grace. And if you are a semi-Pelagian, you are out here. Well, you're a little better. You're a good swimmer. So here you are, head is well above water. And you see that if you had to swim to the shore, which is 10 miles away, you never make it. Because you're a good swimmer, but not that good a swimmer. So if you had to save yourself, you're lost. But, happily for you, the good ship Grace is out there, and you are able to swim to the ship. You can make a start towards salvation, but you still need grace to achieve it, right? Semi-Pelagianism. Arminianism, you're much worse off. You are really bad off. You are, you know, you've gone down once, you've gone down twice. You are almost dead for. You're almost done for. Here you are. There's your nose. Your nose is above water, but barely. You're coughing, you're choking, you're wheezing. You couldn't swim 10 feet. You couldn't swim anywhere. You are really, really in very significant peril. But grace has come on the good ship, and Prevenient Grace has reached you in the form of this life preserver. It is right there. You don't have to swim anywhere. You don't have to exert any more than the most minuscule energy. Just reach out and grab the life preserver. You'll be fine. So the Arminian says there's still a choice you have to make. And if you're going to sit there in the water and resolutely refuse to cooperate with that life preserver, you will be lost. But no one's going to come over and force you to grab that life preserver. You still have to do it. If you're Augustinian, you are stone cold dead. I don't know what facial expression to put here.
Peaceful.
Peaceful. Rest in peace. R.I.P. You are at the bottom of the ocean. You are like a stick or a stone. You are dead like Lazarus was dead. Lazarus couldn't raise himself from the dead, neither can you. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, you were dead in trespasses and sins. There's no, God could throw you 10,000 life preservers. They could be floating all over the place. It'll be a bit of good. If somebody's dead at the bottom of the ocean, throwing them a life preserver doesn't help, Augustine says. The only way you're going to be helped is if God himself jumps into the water, swims down, grabs a lifeless corpse, drags it up, flops it out on the deck of the boat, and breathes into you the breath of life. Calls you back from the dead the way he called Lazarus back from the dead. And that's a sovereign act of God, and at that point you are non-cooperative, Augustine says. You are not helping. You are just dead weight. You know. And Augustine would cite texts like Ephesians chapter 2. While you were dead, God made you alive. It's a very Augustinian verse, isn't it? Not while you were almost dead, while you were dead. So both sides have Bible verses here. You all know that. But those are the kind of verses that Augustine would cite in favor of the proposition that justification happens as a sovereign act of God. All right, we've been swimming around in secondary water, secondary doctrine, and I hope I've been fair, but I hope that does help clarify. This is one of the most important aspects of the Augustinian thought, and so I wanted to spend some time. One more question, Nicole.
Can you repeat that sentence you said for Wesleyan?
Yeah, Wesley said that one of the universal effects of the crucifixion of Christ was that it restored to everybody the capacity to choose. Okay. Universal effect of the crucifixion of Christ restored the ability to choose. It has been a delight, my friends. Arrivederci.